Welcome to another video of Verse and Chapter. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a topic that honestly feels as relevant now as it did over a century and a half ago. It's this compelling, sometimes unsettling idea that history has a peculiar habit of echoing itself. As the great philosopher G.W.F. Hegel observed, significant events and figures often appear twice. But Karl Marx, well, with his characteristic sharpness, he added this profound, even chilling twist. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce.
It's an incredibly potent statement, isn't it? Just that single line immediately sets the stage for what we're going to unpack today. It hints at this cyclical nature of power and revolution. Marx himself used it to frame the events we're talking about,
Right.
drawing these really direct parallels between figures and movements decades apart. Like the radical Danton of the First French Revolution and then the ill-fated Cassidiere in 1848. Or the terrifying Montaigne faction of the 1790s versus its almost comedic counterpart in the mid-19th century. And of course, the big one, the grand uncle, Napoleon I, and his seemingly much, much lesser nephew, Louis Bonaparte.
Absolutely. And that fascinating dynamic is precisely what we're going to explore today in our deep dive into one of Karl Marx's most insightful and, frankly, quite entertaining works, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. This isn't just some dry historical record. It's a vibrant blow-by-blow analysis of the 1851 coup d'etat in France. Marx meticulously dissects how Louis Bonaparte, a figure he famously called a grotesque mediocrity, actually managed to seize absolute power. It's really a masterclass in political analysis, and it was written under the immediate pressure of the events themselves. From December 1851 to March 1852. Originally published as weekly articles for Joseph Wedemeyer's political monthly Die Revolution out in New York.
Yeah, and what's truly revolutionary about Marx's approach here, and what really sets it apart from other accounts of the time, is his primary objective. He wasn't just interested in describing what happened or, pointing fingers at the villain. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part.
Ah.
So it's not a story about one man's evil genius. It's about the deep societal conditions, the class dynamics that allowed such a figure to rise. It really asks why a nation would, tolerate this.
That's a critical distinction, because if you compare Marx's work to other contemporary analyses, their perspectives were so different, weren't they?
Yeah.
Take Victor Hugo's Napoleon le Petit. Hugo, according to Marx anyway, confined himself mostly to bitter and witty invective.
Well.
He saw the coup basically as bolt from the blue, right? A sudden, violent act of a single individual. And ironically, by focusing so intensely on Bonaparte as this solitary force, Hugo inadvertently made him appear great instead of little. He kind of gave Bonaparte more credit than Marx thought he deserved.
Precisely. And then you've got Proudhon's coup d'etat. He tried to frame the coup as a result of antecedent historical development, sort of inevitable maybe. But even Proudhon, for all his intellectual ambition, ended up inadvertently turning his historical construction into what Marx called an apologia for its hero.
An apology. How so?
Well, Marx felt this was the trap of these so-called objective historians. By trying to explain everything through these grand inevitable forces, they somehow end up excusing the actions of the very individuals they're analyzing. It kind of removes their agency or maybe their culpability.
Right, it just had to happen that way.
Yeah.
It really makes you understand why Engels, Marx's lifelong collaborator, later called the 18th Brumaire a work of genius. He lauded its concise epigrammatic exposition that laid bare the whole course of French history since the February days in its interconnection. For Engels, Marx's analysis reduced the miracle of December 2, the coup itself, to a natural, necessary result. It wasn't some random event. It was the logical, though maybe tragic, outcome of these underlying social forces.
It's a bold claim, definitely, but it speaks to the power of Marx's analytical framework. This deep dive into French history served as this crucial proving ground for what Engels would later articulate as Marx's great law of motion of history.
A great law of motion.
Yeah, this law proposes that all historical struggles, whether they look political, religious, philosophical, or, any ideological conflict, are, at their core, only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes. And these class struggles are, in turn, deeply conditioned by their economic position, by the mode of their production, and of their exchange. Engels famously argued that this law holds the same significance for history as the law of the transformation of energy has for natural science. It's trying to find the fundamental engine, the driver of societal change.
Wow. Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now? Well, consider this deep dive a powerful shortcut, maybe. We're going to try and distill Marx's profound insights into this really intricate interplay of social forces, economic realities, and the very real impact of political figures. We'll uncover some surprising facts and hopefully spark some of those aha moments that, resonate with the complex, information-saturated world we live in today. It's about understanding not just what happened in 19th century France, but why it happened, and what timeless lessons it might offer about power, class, and, well, human nature itself. Okay, let's start by really digging into that twice phenomena. Marx, building on Hegel, suggests that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. But then he injects his own, razor-sharp observation. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. He then gives those famous examples, tracing these specific historical parallels in France. The revolutionary firebrand Danton from the 1790s, re-emerging as the less impressive Cossidier in 1848. The radical Robespierre, parodied by Louis Blanc, the powerful Montaigne faction of the original revolution, reduced to this pale imitation in 1848, 1851. And of course, the big one, the formidable uncle, Napoleon I, returning as the nephew, Louis Bonaparte. It's like history was trying to stage a sequel, but the grand drama just turned into something, well, far more absurd, less heroic.
Yeah, and this connection between historical repetition and human agency is just critical. Marx famously states that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past.
Right.
This is the crucial constraint. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living.
A nightmare. Wow. Think about that phrase. It suggests this subconscious, almost inescapable burden.
Exactly. People in these revolutionary moments, they often aspire to create something completely new, right? But they find themselves haunted by the past, almost compelled to reenact its scenes, even if they don't fully realize it.
That brings us to this idea of conjuring the spirits of the past. Marx says that during moments of revolutionary crisis, those on the historical stage, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes.
Yeah.
It's almost theatrical, isn't it? Like a play being restaged with new actors, but familiar props and scripts.
It truly is, and Marx's examples bring this to life so vividly. Think about Martin Luther, who during the Reformation apparently donned the mask of the Apostle Paul, drawing authority from this revered historical figure.
Okay.
Or consider the original French Revolution from 1789 to 1814, which alternately dressed itself in the garb of the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. Heroes like Brutus or Caesar.
Right, invoking Rome.
Exactly. And by 1848, Marx observed, the revolution knew nothing better to do than to parody, now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793-95. They seem to need this historical costume, to legitimize their present struggles.
But you're saying there was a fundamental difference in why they used these historical disguises.
Well, Marx argues yes. For the 18th century bourgeois revolutions, like the original French Revolution, this borrowing from antiquity served a powerful, necessary purpose. It was to glorify the new struggles, to magnify the given task, and maybe crucially, to find once more the spirit of revolution needed to unchain and establish modern bourgeois society.
So it was functional. It helped them achieve their goals.
Right. And once that new bourgeois society was firmly established, those antediluvian colossi, those Roman heroes, they just disappeared. Their historical purpose was fulfilled. They weren't needed anymore. The scaffolding could come down.
Okay, so what about the 19th century then? What was different?
Well, Marx argues that the 19th century presented this unique revolutionary imperative. He says that from 1848 to 1851, only the ghost of the old revolution circulated. France, in his really stark analogy, felt set back into a defunct epoch. He paints this wonderfully absurd, almost pitiful picture of France, sighing about the debts of the Bonaparte family, much like the mad Englishman in Bedlam who thinks he's living in ancient Egypt, suffering for the pharaohs.
So it's not just a historical observation, it's a commentary on how societies can get stuck, right? Trapped by these historical echoes, unable to really forge a new path forward.
Exactly. And this leads him to call for something different. He says the social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It has to strip away all superstition about the past.
Have the dead bury their dead.
In order to arrive at its own content. That's the key phrase. It's where the content goes beyond the phrase. It has to be about substance, not just revolutionary cosplay,
That makes sense. And this brings us to a critical point about the very nature of revolutions themselves. Marx draws this really sharp contrast between the dynamics of 18th century bourgeois revolutions and those of 19th century proletarian ones.
Hmm.
The bourgeois revolutions, he says, they storm swiftly from success to success, filled with dramatic effects, sparkling diamonds, and ecstasy. Sounds exciting.
Yeah,
But they're short-lived, leading to a long Katzenjammer, that great German word for a severe hangover, before society can soberly, assimilate the results. They're fast, flashy, and then comes the disillusionment.
proletarian revolutions, though, are fundamentally different in his view. They constantly criticize themselves, they interrupt themselves in their own course, and they return to the apparently accomplished to begin anew.
So lots of stopping and starting.
Right. They deride with cruel thoroughness their own first attempts, and they recoil constantly from the indefinite colossalness of their own goals. This isn't some quick sprint. It's a much more arduous, self-reflective, and frankly, often frustrating process. It demands a deeper, more fundamental transformation of society. The content, like we said, has to go beyond the phrase.
And this leads us to a pivotal moment, a kind of breaking point captured by a maxim Marx uses. Hey, Rhodus, hic salta.
Oh, yes. Here is Rhodes. Here, jump.
Exactly. But for Marx, it has this very specific, powerful implication, right? It's not just about, put your money where your mouth is.
No, it signifies the point where all turning back is impossible, and the conditions themselves call out for revolutionary action. It means the solution isn't just some abstract idea anymore. The actual material conditions for its realization are present, demanding immediate, decisive action. Jump now, because the conditions are right here.
Okay, got it.
And this is why the coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, struck the Democrats at the time like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Marx noted these complacent yelps of victory from Democrats who were absolutely convinced a miracle would happen on the second Sunday in May 1852, when Louis Bonaparte's presidential term was legally set to expire. They thought destiny was on their side.
But that belief in miracles was, as Marx cuttingly observes, just a refuge for weakness. They were kind of blind to the storm that was brewing right in front of them.
Yeah.
And that's where the enduring riddle of this period lies for Marx. How a nation of 36 millions can be surprised and delivered without resistance into captivity by 3 nights of industry. He's referring to Bonaparte and his key conspirators. It's a question that Marx sets out to answer, not with some simple explanation, but by meticulously laying bare the complex political and social landscape of France in the years leading up to that coup. This wasn't a sudden, unpreventable act. It was, in his view, the inevitable conclusion of a whole series of events. Hashtag 2. The tumultuous path of the bourgeois republic, 1848 to 1849. So let's unpack that tumultuous path, the one that paved the way for this thunderbolt moment. Marx masterfully breaks down the French Revolution from 1848 to 1851 into 3 distinct periods, which gives us a really clear analytical framework. First, there's the February period, spanning from February 24th to May 4th, 1848. He calls this the prologue.
Right, the prologue. And this initial phase was characterized by, well, immediate confusion and provisional declarations. The revolution, initially fueled by calls for electoral reform, quickly escalated way beyond its initial demands. It led to the swift overthrow of Louis Philippe and the sort of spontaneous emergence of the Republic.
Spontaneous, okay.
Yeah, and the provisional government that formed was, by its own admission, tentative. It was this chaotic blend of high-flown phrases and actual uncertainty and clumsiness, mixing enthusiastic striving for innovation with the deeply rooted domination of the old routines.
It's like a lot of revolutionary fervor with very little practical direction, maybe.
Pretty much. And during this time, the Paris proletariat, having, secured it arms in hand in the streets, famously proclaimed the republic to be a social republic.
A social republic? That sounds like a huge step.
It sounds like it, but Marx quickly points out the ironic reality. While it indicated the general content of the modern revolution, meaning a desire for fundamental social change, it was in singular contradiction to what was immediately realized in practice.
Why? What was the contradiction?
Because the material conditions and, crucially, the level of mass education simply weren't ready to support such a radical transformation. The idea was there, the aspiration, but the means, the foundation, were not.
Got it.
So while the proletariat still reveled in the vision of the wide prospects and engaged in these seriously meant discussions of social problems, something else was happening behind the scenes. The old powers of society had grouped themselves, assembled, reflected, and found unexpected support in the mass of the nation, the peasants and petty bourgeois.
Ah, so the conservatives were regrouping.
Exactly. These groups had suddenly become politically relevant after the fall of the July monarchy's very restrictive electoral barriers. So this early period, though seemingly chaotic, was actually a crucial hidden regrouping of forces. It foreshadowed the shifting alliances and eventual betrayals that would define the next phase.
Okay, which leads us to the second period. The Constitution of the Republic, or the Constituent National Assembly. This runs from May 4th, 1848 to May 28, 1849. And this assembly, emerging from national elections, was explicitly tasked with one thing, right? To reduce the results of the revolution to the bourgeois scale. It was a direct counter to those more radical aspirations for a social republic that had popped up in February.
Precisely. And the proletariat's attempts to resist this restaling, this rollback, were brutally put down. On May 15th, 1848, the Paris proletariat attempted to negate its existence forcibly, as Marx puts it, but failed. This led to the removal of key radical leaders like Blanqui.
Okay.
But that was just a prelude to what Marx calls the most colossal event in the history of European civil wars, the June insurrection.
The June days.
Yes. The assembly, now firmly controlled by bourgeois interests, declared the demands of the Paris proletariat utopian nonsense, setting the stage for this dramatic and incredibly bloody showdown.
It was an incredibly brutal conflict, wasn't it? The bourgeois republic ultimately triumphed, and with nearly every segment of society uniting against the Paris proletariat. Marx describes this powerful, almost unbelievable alliance. The aristocracy of finance, the industrial bourgeoisie, the middle class, the petty bourgeois, the army, the lumpen proletariat organized as the mobile guard, the intellectual lights, the clergy, and the rural population.
Basically everyone.
Everyone stood united against the Paris proletariat, which, as Marx says, stood none but itself. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Over 3,000 insurgents butchered and 15,000 deported without trial.
15,000 deported without trial.
Yeah. This crushing defeat, Marx explains, pushed the proletariat into the background of the revolutionary stage. It was a clear, brutal demonstration of force against any kind of radical social change.
And this victory was incredibly revealing for Marx. It exposed a brutal truth, that in old, class-developed civilizations like France, the term bourgeois republic ultimately signifies the unlimited despotism of one class over other classes.
So much for liberty, equality, fraternity.
Exactly. It wasn't about universal liberty. It was about the absolute rule of the bourgeoisie, maintained through violence when necessary. This was a moment of profound clarity for Marx, highlighting the true nature of the state in a society with these deeply entrenched class divisions.
And out of this brutal suppression, a new, unified political force emerged, one that Marx calls the Party of Order. The June days saw all these disparate classes and parties, legitimists, Orleanists, Bonapartists, even some disaffected Republicans, unite against the proletariat. They coalesced under these watchwords: property, family, religion, order.
The Big Four.
Yeah. This became a universal accusation, right? A powerful cudgel to wield. Any deviation from their exclusive interest, any talk of social reform was immediately stigmatized as socialism.
Right. Anything we don't like is socialism.
Exactly. And Marx notes the bitter irony that eventually, even the high priests of religion and order themselves are driven with kicks from their Pythian tripods in its name. They use the label so broadly, it ultimately consumed their own political power. #3, the contradictory constitution and the ascendancy of the military.
So after that bloody gin victory, the Republican faction of the bourgeoisie, those, pure political tricolor Republicans, they actually enjoyed exclusive rule for a bit from June 24th to December 10th, 1848.
It's ironic, though, isn't it? Their power wasn't gained through some liberal uprising against a monarchy, but through a rising of the proletariat against capital, or rising laid low with grape shot. They inherited a republic born not of universal ideals, but of violence directed squarely against the working class.
Yeah, it's a very shaky foundation.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the inherent contradictions within the 1848 Constitution itself. Marx describes it as essentially a republicanized version of the 1830 Charter, which was a pre-revolutionary document. Now, while it proclaimed direct universal suffrage, which was a crucial gain from the February Revolution, it immediately added this restrictive 6 months residence proviso.
Which disenfranchised who?
A large number of transient workers, people who moved for jobs. So universal suffrage, but not really universal.
Right.
And when it came to foundational liberties, press, speech, association, education, they were proclaimed as the absolute right of the French citoyen, but always with the marginal note that it is unlimited so far as it is not limited by the equal rights of others and the public safety or by laws.
So freedom on paper, but with this immediate crippling asterisk. Every promise of liberty was instantly curtailed by these clauses designed to nullify them.
Pretty much. Marx brilliantly dissects this, saying each paragraph of the Constitution contains its own antithesis, its own upper and lower house, namely liberty in the general phrase, abrogation of liberty in the marginal note.
Wow. Liberty in the headline, no liberty in the fine print.
Exactly. And the Friends of Order, that newly coalesced ruling bloc, they were quick to use future organic laws to effectively strip away these freedoms for anyone outside their interests, solely in the interest of public safety, that is, Marx adds, the safety of the bourgeoisie. It's a masterclass in how legal language can be used to mask repression.
So what was the Constitution's fatal design flaw then? Its Achilles heel.
Marx identifies it as being vulnerable in one point, not in the heel, but in the head, or rather in the two heads it wound up with. The Legislative Assembly on the one hand, the President on the other.
Two heads are not better than one here.
Apparently not. The Assembly held legislative omnipotence and could, constitutionally, remove the President. However, the President could only remove the Assembly unconstitutionally, only by setting aside the Constitution itself.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It set up this inherent, almost inevitable clash of powers, a ticking time bomb right in the structure of government.
And the president, Louis Bonaparte, he had this unique and powerful mandate, didn't he?
He did. While the Assembly's 750 members split the national vote across many districts and diverse interests, the president was elected by all Frenchmen through direct suffrage, concentrating millions of votes on a single individual.
So he could claim to represent the whole nation.
Right. This gave him a sort of divine right against the Assembly. He was president by the grace of the people. And Article 45 of the Constitution decreed his power ceased after 4 years, which Marx wryly calls a prophecy of its own early death. The pure Republicans tried to prevent this by requiring a 3/4 vote for constitutional revision, an impotent attempt, Marx calls it, that would ultimately fail spectacularly.
And what's also fascinating here is Marx's observation about the state of siege, this truly French invention born right out of this moment.
Yeah, the state of siege in Paris was the midwife of the Constituent Assembly. It had to be protected in its mother's womb and brought into existence by bayonets turned against the people.
So the Assembly needed military protection from the people it supposedly represented.
That's the implication. And this splendid invention, as Marx sarcastically calls it, became this recurring tool throughout the period. It allowed the barrack and bivouac, saber and musket, mustache and uniform to act as judges, administrators, guardians, censors.
Basically running things.
Periodically laid on French society's head to compress its brain and render it quiet.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it basically normalized military repression as a solution to political unrest.
Yes. And these military forces, as Marx grimly suggests, were bound to hit upon the idea of instead saving society once and for all by proclaiming their own regime as the highest. Why let the civilians mess it up?
And they expected better cash payment for their higher services, naturally.
Naturally. Marx even points out that Colonel Bernard, the guy who had deported 15,000 insurgents from the June uprising, was back, right at the head of military commissions. It shows this very clear, disturbing trajectory towards military control and its own self-serving interests.
And this trajectory culminates with the December 10th, 1848 presidential election. This marked the end of Cavaignac's brief dictatorship and the Constituent Assembly itself. Louis Bonaparte won a resounding victory. What's striking, though, is the questionable legitimacy of his win, given his irregular citizenship. He was a former English special constable and a naturalized Swiss citizen.
Despite Article 44 of the very Constitution he swore to uphold, requiring him to be a French citizen.
He wasn't even fully qualified for the office.
Nope.
And Marx describes his victory as fundamentally a, quote, reaction of the peasants who had had to pay the costs of the February Revolution against the remaining classes of the nation, a reaction of the country against the town.
That's a key dynamic.
He also garnered support from the army, who felt neglected by the Republicans, from the big bourgeoisie, who saw him as a potential bridge back to a stable monarchy.
Or at least stability.
Right, stability.
Yeah.
And even from segments of the proletarians and petty bourgeois who viewed him mainly as a scourge for Cavaignac, the general who crushed the June uprising.
So it was this broad but deeply contradictory coalition of support. Marx dissects it brilliantly to show its inherent instability. It couldn't last, #5, the decline of Parliament and the consolidation of Bonaparte's power. So the period from December 1848 to May 1849 saw the swift and, well, almost poetic fall of those pure Republicans. They had effectively suppressed the revolutionary working class elements in June, but then, ironically, they were themselves thrust aside by the mass of the bourgeoisie, the broader ruling class, who were predominantly royalist. Their ignominious history, as Marx calls it, ended pretty quickly. Their brief moment of exclusive rule was gone.
And what's truly fascinating here is the rise of the Party of Order. This broader bourgeoisie, despite being internally split, right? You had the Legitimists representing large landowners wanting a Bourbon restoration, and the Orleanists representing finance and industrial capital wanting a July monarchy restoration.
Two different royal families, basically.
Exactly. But they found common ground in the bourgeois republic. It became this kind of neutral territory, a form where they could rule conjointly under the unifying name of capital.
It transcended their dynastic squabbles, at least for a while, allowing them to consolidate power against the perceived threat of social revolution from below.
And Bonaparte, ever the opportunist, immediately appointed a ministry drawn from this Party of Order, led by Odilon Barrot. There's a delicious irony here, isn't there? Barrot, a longtime liberal figure who had pushed for parliamentary reform under the old monarchy, was now tasked with putting a parliament to death. The very forces of parliamentarianism were being used to dismantle parliament itself.
It's quite the twist. And this new ministry wasted absolutely no time in undermining the assembly, effectively setting a blueprint for Bonaparte's future coup. For example, they secretly agreed to the Roman expedition and intervention to restore papal rule in Rome, wresting funds from the assembly under false pretenses.
Lying to Parliament about what the money was for.
Essentially, yes. And conspiring with the absolutist powers abroad. This is a clear act of deception and a blatant, premeditated betrayal of parliamentary procedure.
And they didn't stop there, did they? The Party of Order vociferously pushed for the Constituent Assembly's dissolution.
Constantly.
They argued it was necessary for credit and order, always complaining that the country was tired of it.
And Marx acutely observes that Bonaparte learned it by heart. Later, using these exact arguments against them, they were, in effect, teaching him how to overthrow them.
Wow.
They even went so far as to incite petitions across France for the assembly to decamp, effectively teaching Bonaparte to appeal against the parliamentary assemblies to the people. They normalized executive appeals directly to the public, over the heads of the legislature.
It's astonishing, their complicity in their own eventual downfall. On January 29, 1849, the Assembly's building was actually occupied by military forces under General Changarnier, who was the Party of Order's own general.
Right. Marx explicitly calls this event, the coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, only carried out by the Royalists with Bonaparte against the Republican National Assembly.
For a dress rehearsal.
Pretty much. And Bonaparte, ever the shrewd observer, seized with avidity on just this first public summoning of the military power against the parliamentary power. He was taking meticulous notes, learning exactly how to orchestrate his own takeover later on.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Despite having used the Party of Order to achieve his aims, Bonaparte then abruptly dismissed the Barrot ministry on November 1st, 1849.
Yep.
Marx describes this as a decisive turning point. Bonaparte was shedding the strawman mask, as Marx puts it, to assert his own independence and consolidate power directly under himself.
And his pretexts for dismissal were very telling, revealing his true motives. The ministry, he claimed, neglected the president's authority. They even disavowed his attempts to show political importance, like his ill-advised letter about the Pope's illiberal attitude after the Roman intervention. And critically, they refused to increase his civil list, his personal allowance.
Oh, the money again.
Always the money. Bonaparte, as Marx notes, viewed this not just as a salary, but as payment for his mission to restore the empire, and, perhaps more urgently, to pay his considerable personal debts. This wasn't about policy disagreements, it was about personal power and solvency.
And this highlights a fundamental aspect of French political power at the time, this immense state machine. In France, with its vast bureaucracy controlling over 500,000 officials and deeply intertwined with the bourgeoisie's own material interest, losing control of ministerial posts meant the National Assembly forfeits all real influence.
Right, the state is the power.
Exactly. The bourgeoisie, ironically needing state salaries for its surplus population, its own unemployed or underemployed members, inadvertently strengthened the executive power by constantly increasing repressive measures and expanding the state apparatus. They were, as Marx observes, ultimately annihilating the vital conditions of all parliamentary power. They were sawing off the very branch they were sitting on.
And the new ministry that followed, the Hopeful Ministry, was a clear signal of Bonaparte's direct control. There was no prime minister. Bonaparte abolished that dignity, signaling he was now the sole executive authority.
Taking charge.
And it contained only one figure of parliamentary standing, Fold, a notoriously self-serving financier. This cemented Bonaparte's alliance with the Bourse, the Paris stock exchange, where Bonaparte's stocks would now rise and fall with his fortunes, and his direct control of the police, with Carlier appointed as prefect. He was building his own independent power base, separate from Parliament.
So he was consolidating power, but also trying to win over public opinion with what Marx calls these childishly silly proposals.
Yeah.
Things like small pay increases for non-commissioned officers, or an honor system loan bank for workers. These were the financial science of the lumpen proletariat, Marx snipes, designed to show his popular appeal and highlight his idée napoléonienne, this is grand vision for a restored empire.
He genuinely seemed to believe he was an unrecognized genius whom all the world takes for a simpleton.
Meanwhile, what about the Party of Order's increasing use of the socialism label? That seems crucial.
Absolutely critical. They passed deeply repressive laws like reintroducing the unpopular wine tax and an education law placing schools firmly under clergy control, essentially entrusting the French mind to their hereditary enemies, the Jesuits, as Marx saw it.
But the socialism label itself was weaponized, wasn't it?
Completely. It became this catch-all insult, a convenient smear. Any demand for reform, any liberal idea, any opposition whatsoever was quickly labeled socialistic. The bourgeoisie, Marx argues, came to this terrifying realization. All the weapons it had forged against feudalism turned their points against itself. They saw that all the so-called bourgeois liberties and organs of progress attacked and menaced its class rule at its social foundation and its political summit simultaneously, and had therefore become socialistic.
Free speech, socialism, freedom of assembly, socialism.
Because even their own tools became suspect. Exactly. This reveals this profound self-destructive logic. The bourgeoisie, in its overwhelming fear of social revolution, confessed that its own interests dictate that it should be delivered from the danger of its own rule.
Wait, they wanted less power.
They realized that to restore tranquility in the country, its bourgeois parliament must, first of all, be given its quietus, that to preserve its social power intact, its political power must be broken.
Wow.
They were willing to save their purse, their economic interests, even if it meant forfeiting the crown of political rule. This parliamentary regime, which, as Marx says, lives in struggle and by struggle, couldn't forbid open discussion. And by relying on majorities, it implicitly invited the great majorities outside parliament to decide their fate. That became too scary for them.
So if you're the bourgeoisie and you've used every tool you have to suppress any perceived threat to property and order, even your own parliamentary power starts to look like a liability if it causes unrest or allows dissent.
Precisely. And this creates the perfect opening for an executive power like Bonaparte that promises order above all else, no matter the cost to democratic institutions.
As Bonaparte solidified his grip, the financial squeeze in the assembly really intensified, didn't it? He immediately sought this dramatic increase to his civil list from 600,000 francs to 3 million.
A huge jump.
And Marx calls this an act of chantage, basically blackmail. Bonaparte essentially threatened to denounce the assembly's own crime of violating the people's sovereignty by abolishing universal suffrage, unless they paid him off.
He claimed damages for the votes, which he said he had retrospectively been cheated out of, using their own unconstitutional acts right back against them. It was audacious.
And the assembly, caught in this double weakness, terrified of both Bonaparte and the people, found itself in an impossible position.
Completely trapped.
They grudgingly granted him 2.16 million francs, which demonstrated their vexation but also their profound vulnerability. This unwilling concession just highlighted how much power had shifted away from the legislature towards the executive.
They were stuck between their principles, such as they were, and their fear of even greater chaos if they refused him.
And what did Bonaparte use this money for? Well, part of it went to fund his infamous private army, the Society of December 10th.
Ah, yes, the Decembrists.
Formed in 1849, ostensibly as a benevolent society, it was anything but, according to Marx. He vividly describes it as the lumpen proletariat of Paris organized into secret sections, each section led by Bonapartist agents.
This was Bonaparte sans phrase, as Marx puts it, without phrase, meaning his true, unvarnished base of support. Its members were the decayed roués, vagabonds, discharged jailbirds, swindlers, pimps, and beggars, the La Bohème of Paris.
So the absolute fringes of society.
Exactly. Marx explains that this was the only class upon which he can base himself unconditionally, where he rediscovers in mass form the interests which he personally pursues. This was his loyal, utterly dependent personal army drawn from the dregs of society.
And their function, what did they actually do?
They improvised public enthusiasm during his tours, shouting "Vive l'Empereur," and they were used to insult and physically thrash Republicans, often under the protection of Bonaparte's police.
So street thugs, basically.
That's Marx's portrayal. While Bonaparte publicly maintained these phrases of order, religion, family, and property, he was secretly employing this society of disorder, prostitution, and theft. It was a complete facade, a dangerous hypocrisy.
And things got even darker when a police commissioner, Jan, reported their plan to assassinate key figures like the powerful General Changarnier and the parliamentary president Dupin.
Assassination plots.
Right. Bonaparte, playing coy, providently disbanded his society, naturally only on paper, just before parliamentary inquiry could expose his secret world. Very convenient timing.
Very convenient indeed. And what's crucial to understand alongside this is the military's growing sway during this period. Bonaparte cannily used the funds he extorted to treat officers and non-commissioned officers in his Élysée apartments and at these lavish army reviews. This led to politically charged cries of "Vive Napoleon! Vivant les saucissons!"
Long live Napoleon. Long live the sausages. What was that about?
Well, apparently he plied them with sausages and champagne. It was a direct appeal to the soldiers, buying their loyalty, undermining any allegiance they might have had to Parliament or the Republic.
And General Changarnier, who was seen as the bulwark of society by the Party of Order, he tried to maintain military discipline against these overtly political demonstrations.
He did. He issued orders against soldiers shouting political slogans. But Bonaparte, despite initial ministerial resistance, forced Changarnier's dismissal on January 12, 1851. This split his military command and neutralized a really powerful potential opponent. It was a critical blow to the Assembly's authority over the armed forces.
And this act fundamentally shifted the power dynamic, didn't it?
Absolutely. By repulsing the army, which places itself in the person of Changarnier at its disposal, and so surrendering the army irrevocably to the president, the Party of Order declares that the bourgeoisie has forfeited its vocation to rule.
They gave away the army.
They effectively did. They lost their grip on both the regular army and the National Guard, becoming, in Marx's cutting phrase, sans eyes, sans ears, sans teeth, sans everything, reduced to just growling remonstrances post festum, complaining after the fact. It was a self-inflicted wound exposing their utter powerlessness.
And this leads us to what Marx termed parliamentary cretinism. It's such a powerful, almost clinical diagnosis of their political paralysis.
It really is.
The Party of Order, despite losing its independent majority and being internally fractured, just continued to engage in these petty jurisdictional squabbles with the executive. They failed to take up the conflict at the moment when this has significance from the standpoint of principle. They were too busy arguing over trivialities to see the existential threat looming over them.
You see this so clearly in their stunning failure to decisively act on Bonaparte's fraudulent gold bars lottery scheme. Marx calls it a downright swindle, where Bonaparte apparently manufactured false lottery tickets.
Seriously.
Yeah. This was a clear violation of the Code Penal, the criminal code, showing the systemic corruption at play. And yet the Assembly simply moved on, didn't pursue it.
Unbelievable.
This parliamentary cretinism was a malady, Marx says, that made them believe their parliamentary victories, like winning minor debates, were actual victories, even as they destroyed the very conditions of their own power. They essentially gave him the opportunity to humiliate the National Assembly afresh.
Yeah.
They were digging their own grave with legislative debates and procedural points.
And all of this was happening against this backdrop of growing despair within the bourgeoisie itself. France was experiencing a minor trade crisis in 1851, declining exports, factory closures, commercial bankruptcies.
Economic trouble.
Now, this was a broader European phenomenon, shared with England, likely driven by overproduction and overspeculation. But the French bourgeoisie, in their skill, knowledge, spiritual insight, and intellectual resources, as Marx sarcastically puts it,
Yeah, I sense the sarcasm.
falsely attributed this economic downturn to purely political causes, the instability of the provisional state and the endless parliamentary struggles.
Blaming politics for economic woes. A classic move.
Right. And this misdiagnosis led this desperate cry from the commercial bourgeoisie. Rather an end with terror than terror without end.
Wow, that says it all.
This sentiment perfectly captured their frantic desire for tranquility, leading them to demand an end to parliamentary struggles, even if it meant sacrificing their own political power for the sake of private business. They were willing to trade political freedom for what they perceived as economic stability, however illusory that might be.
So if you're following Marx's analysis, the coup was absolutely not a surprise. He asserts that it had cast its shadow before since 1849. It was openly discussed, repeatedly postponed. Bonaparte himself was so obsessed by it that he continually betrayed it and blurted it out, yet was so weak that he gave it up again. He kept talking about it but seemed unable to pull the trigger.
So everyone knew it was coming.
The Parisian public was apparently so used to its specter that they were not willing to believe in it when it finally appeared in the flesh. It succeeded, despite its indiscretion and with its foreknowledge, a necessary, inevitable result of antecedent developments. The stage was not just set. The curtain was already twitching, and everyone was sort of watching it.
And the Parliament's final acts just demonstrated its ultimate impotence, right?
Completely. It rejected Bonaparte's proposal to restore universal suffrage, effectively tore up its mandate once more, confirming its transformation into this usurpatory parliament of a class, one that refused to represent the broader populace.
And then it defeated its own Quaestor's bill.
Yes. The proposal to requisition troops and form a parliamentary army. By defeating that, it proved it had cut into the muscles which connected the parliamentary head with the body of the nation. It was incapable of transacting business. Its atomic constituents, no longer held together by any force of cohesion, it had drawn its last breath. It was dead. The parliament essentially dismantled itself right before the end.
So, with the stage impeccably set and the assembly rendered utterly impotent, we arrive at the final act. Bonaparte's preparations were deliberate and, frankly, cynical. On October 10th, he announced his decision to restore universal suffrage, a really popular move designed to win public favor, and it triggered ministerial resignations from those in the party of order who opposed him.
Clearing the decks.
Exactly. He then appointed his most loyal allies to key positions. The Thorigny ministry, Malpas as the crucial police prefect, and General Magnan consolidating reliable regiments in the capital. He was methodically dismantling the existing power structures, replacing them piece by piece with his own loyalists.
And Parliament, astonishingly, continued its self-defeat right up to the bitter end. When the National Assembly reconvened on November 4, Marx says it had nothing better to do than to recapitulate the course it had gone through, and to prove that it was buried only after it had died.
Just going through the motions.
Pretty much. It rejected Bonaparte's proposal to restore universal suffrage again on November 13 by a narrow margin, 355 to 348 votes, effectively confirming that it had become this usurpatory parliament of a class, completely unwilling to compromise or adapt to survive.
And then, in this desperate, last-ditch attempt to assert its authority, the legislative power introduced the Quaestor's bill again, aiming to establish its right to requisition troops and form a parliamentary army, something it really should have done months, if not years, earlier.
You're too late.
Way too late. But by merely debating this right, instead of acting decisively, it betrayed its doubts about its own powers and made public confession of its impotence when the bill was ultimately defeated. The Montaigne, the leftist faction, actually cast the deciding votes against it, fearing it would be used against them.
So total paralysis and mistrust on all sides.
Exactly. They were asking for permission to do what they should have simply done, and in doing so, prove their own political paralysis beyond any doubt.
And what's truly astonishing, and something that should really make us all pause, is the bourgeoisie's profound self-betrayal in this moment. On November 25, at a public event awarding prize medals, Bonaparte captivated the industrial bourgeoisie. He promised tranquility for the future and condemned monarchist hallucinations and demagogues. He strategically positioned himself as the sole savior from political chaos, the only one capable of bringing stability.
And the industrial bourgeoisie, what did they do? They applauded with servile bravos the coup d'etat of December 2, the annihilation of Parliament, the downfall of its own rule, the dictatorship of Bonaparte.
They cheered for their own destruction.
Oh. It's an incredibly stark, almost unbelievable image Marx paints. The thunder of applause on November 25th had its answer in the thunder of cannon on December 4th, when Bonaparte's troops fired on protesting crowds, directly impacting those who had so blindly applauded just days before. They literally cheered on their own political demise for the promise of stability, and some paid for it with their lives.
And so, the December 2nd, 1851, coup d'etat unfolded. Not with the grandeur or military genius of Cromwell or Napoleon I, but, as Marx notes, with the underhanded methods of the criminal courts and the Society of December 10th.
How so?
Bonaparte stole 25 million francs from the Bank of France to finance it, bribed generals and soldiers with cash and promises, and acted secretly like a thief in the night. It was, in Marx's telling, a squalid, ignoble affair based on bribery and deceit.
Key parliamentary leaders were dragged from their beds in the middle of the night and imprisoned. Paris squares and the parliamentary building were occupied by troops loyal to him. Placards plastered across the city proclaimed the dissolution of the National Assembly and the Council of State, the restoration of universal suffrage, his popular move, and a state of siege in the Scene Department.
Taking complete control.
A small group of parliamentarians tried to meet and vote for Bonaparte's deposition, but were quickly surrounded and arrested. Thus ended, Marx writes, the Party of Order, the Legislative Assembly, and the February Revolution. It was a swift, decisive, and utterly humiliating end to France's Second Republic.
And if we briefly summarize Marx's overview of the revolution's whole trajectory, we see this clear, almost deterministic progression. It began with the Universal Brotherhood swindle of February, that initial illusion of a republic for all.
Right.
This was followed by the proletariat's brutal defeat in June 1848, then the brief dictatorship of the bourgeois republicans, their subsequent fall, and the defeat of the petty bourgeois democracy.
Layer by layer.
Exactly. This paved the way for the parliamentary dictatorship of the Party of Order, which then engaged in this prolonged, self-destructive struggle between the parliamentary bourgeoisie and Bonaparte himself. This ultimately culminated in the complete collapse of the parliamentary regime and the triumph of executive power under Bonaparte. It's a relentless downward spiral, showing how a class, in its desperation to maintain social order, can willingly sacrifice its own political power.
It's a truly chilling story of how a figure Marx deemed a grotesque mediocrity seized absolute power through the precise, almost surgical exploitation of the contradictions, the divisions, and the fears within French society. #, and 7, the enduring state machine and the paradox of peasant rule.
And what was the ultimate result of all this so-called Cossack Republic? Marx describes it as the French bourgeoisie, in its fervent fear of the proletariat, inadvertently bringing the lumpen proletariat to domination, with the chief, the Society of December 10, at the head.
So they got the very opposite of what they wanted.
In a way, yes. They had cried out to the revolution, "Huge taste, quiesce, flee, be silent, keep still." And now Bonaparte, embodying the state, cried it right back at them, silencing them completely.
Wow.
It's a profound irony. All the repressive measures the bourgeoisie had painstakingly crafted and wielded against the revolution, destroying the press, mass surveillance, disbanding the National Guard, imposing the state of siege, military commissions, clerical control over education, jailing without trial, all of it was now turned, with even greater ferocity, against them by Bonaparte.
Hoisted by their own petard.
Exactly. Marx observes that Napoleon's earlier dilemma, whether Europe would be Republican or Cossack, was resolved, for France at least, in the Cossack Republic. The bourgeois republic lost nothing but the semblance of respectability. The underlying despotism was always there, just now unconcealed and directed at its former wielders.
So a crucial question arises. Why didn't the Paris proletariat rise up in revolt after December 2? Why didn't they fight Bonaparte?
Marx addresses this directly. He argues, first, that the overthrow of the bourgeoisie had only been decreed, not truly carried out in a way that empowered the working class. They weren't in a position to take over. And second, a serious insurrection of the proletariat would at once have put new life into the bourgeoisie, reconciled it with the army, and ensured a second June defeat. They were still too vulnerable, and a premature uprising would have simply unified their enemies against them, just like in 1848.
So a strategic silence, not apathy.
Largely, yes. Bonaparte was also incredibly shrewd in his manipulation. He initially intimidated resistance by abolishing the secret ballot, then quickly restored it to pacify the bourgeois and shopkeepers, who then, predictably, failed to appear to fight against the coup.
Give them back one small thing so they accept the bigger loss.
Right. And crucially, Bonaparte had also robbed the Paris proletariat of its leaders through mass arrests on December 1st and 2nd, leaving them an army without officers. They were also wary of fighting under the Montagnard leftist parliamentary banner due to past devastating defeats when they'd allied with them. So their silence was less apathy and more a grim recognition of the overwhelming forces stacked against them.
This brings us to one of Marx's most famous lines, a quote he borrows from Goethe's Faust. Well burrowed, old mole.
Ah, yes.
What does he mean by that here? It sounds cryptic.
He uses it to signify the revolution's deeper hidden process. He means that the revolution is thoroughgoing, working methodically beneath the surface, even during periods of reaction. It first perfected parliamentary power, he argues, so it could then completely overthrow it. And now, he says, it will complete the executive power, reduces it to its purest expression, isolates it, sets it up against itself as the sole target in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it.
So Bonaparte's dictatorship is actually helping the revolution in the long run.
That's Marx's dialectical argument. By perfecting the state's repressive power, Bonaparte is creating the very conditions for its eventual total destruction. This, he believes, will ultimately lead to Europe's exaltation, the final decisive showdown against the concentrated power of the state itself.
Okay. And what's truly terrifying is Marx's description of the parasitic state apparatus that had been built up in France over centuries.
It really is. He calls the executive power an enormous bureaucratic and military organization, a terrifying parasitic body with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, that enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all its pores.
1 million people.
1 million people actively maintaining the state, essentially living off the rest of society, a huge parasite feeding on the nation.
And this isn't just a sudden development under Bonaparte, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. Marx stresses that it emerged from the absolute monarchy, was perfected by the First French Revolution and Napoleon, and then strengthened by all subsequent revolutions. Each party, upon taking power, perfected this machine instead of breaking it. The various political parties, in their turn, regarded its possession as the chief spoils of the victor, the ultimate prize to be won. It's this almost inescapable trap, a self-perpetuating system of control that just keeps growing.
But only under the second Bonaparte did the state seem to become completely independent, with the chief of the Society of December 10th, that figure embodying the lumpen proletariat at its head.
Yeah, this was an adventurer dropped in from abroad, raised on the shoulders of a drunken soldiery which he bought with whiskey and sausages. This ignoble ascent, Marx concludes, left France with a low-spirited despair and a feeling of monstrous humiliation and degradation. The country was governed by its lowest common denominator, propped up by this independent parasitic state.
So if the state machine became independent, what was Bonaparte's actual foundation of support? Where did his real power come from?
Marx points squarely to the most numerous class of French society, the small-holding peasants.
The peasants? But weren't they being crushed by debt?
Yes, but their situation was complex. He famously calls them the sack of potatoes class.
Why?
Because while they live in similar conditions, their mode of production isolates them from each other, like potatoes in a sack. This prevents them from forming a coherent class capable of asserting their own interests directly through, say, political parties or unions.
Okay.
They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented by an unlimited governmental power and a master who can impose order from above and claim to act in their name.
Enter Louis Bonaparte.
Exactly. This explains the enduring Napoleonic legend and its fulfillment. The peasants' deeply ingrained belief in a Napoleon who would bring glory back, protect their small holdings, and restore order coincided perfectly with Louis Bonaparte's fixed idea of imperial restoration. The December 10th, 1848 election was, in Marx's view, consummated only by the coup d'état of December 2nd, 1851, as it was a mandate from the peasantry that he fully realized through force and manipulation.
And this was the conservative peasant, right? Not the revolutionary one. Seeking to consolidate his small plot of land and relying on the ghosts of the empire and superstition over enlightenment.
Right, and the bourgeoisie's hypocrisy here is glaring. While the parliamentary republic had actually begun to revolutionize some peasants through education and political engagement, the bourgeoisie violently suppressed their stirrings whenever they seemed too radical.
Via rural uprising.
Exactly. Then they hypocritically cried out against the stupidity of the masses, who subsequently betrayed them by supporting Bonaparte. The bourgeoisie itself, in its fear of rural radicalism, quote, violently strengthened the imperialism of the peasant class by alienating them from progressive forces and pushing them towards Bonaparte.
And here's the ultimate paradox Marx uncovers. The Napoleonic property form, that small independent peasant holding, which was initially a source of emancipation from feudalism, eventually became the law of their enslavement and their pauperism over generations.
How?
Due to the progressive deterioration of agriculture and progressive indebtedness, Parceling out land, lack of investment, mortgage debt, it all caught up. The very Code Napoleon, which enshrined their property rights, is now nothing but the codex of distraints, of forced sales, and compulsory auctions, driving millions to hover on the margin of existence. What once promised freedom now ensured their misery.
So the system that created them was now destroying them.
Precisely. And this grim reality dramatically shifts their potential alliances. The peasants' interests are now in opposition to bourgeois interests, to capital. Their natural ally and leader, Marx concludes, is no longer a distant emperor figure, but the urban proletariat. The economic pressures of capitalism were forcing these seemingly disparate classes into a shared opposition to the ruling order.
Which brings us to the Napoleonic ideas in practice under Louis Bonaparte. How did they actually play out?
Well, the strong and unlimited government, the first core idea, meant defending material order by force, naturally.
Yeah.
And heavy taxes became the life source of the bureaucracy, the army, the priests, and the court.
Feeding the parasite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Napoleon I maybe repaid taxes with plunder from conquest. Now, Bonaparte's regime simply robs his industry of its last resources. His very first financial acts, naturally, were raising official salaries and creating new unnecessary government jobs.
Sinecures.
All right. Then there's the third Idée Napoléonienne, the domination of priests as instruments of government control. While initial smallholding owners might have been traditionally religious, now ruined by debts, they are naturally irreligious due to their crushing economic reality. The priest, in this context, appears as only the anointed bloodhound of the earthly police, keeping them in line.
Not a spiritual guide, but a cop.
That's the implication. Marx chillingly notes that the expedition against Rome to restore the Pope will take place in France itself next time, but in a sense opposite. The religious control would be turned inward against the disillusioned populace.
And finally, the culminating Idée Napoléonienne is the ascendancy of the army. It was the point d'honneur of the peasants, their state costume, their poetry, the symbol of national pride and strength they associated with Napoleon I.
But the reality had changed.
Dramatically. The peasants' true enemies were no longer the Cossacks invading from Russia. They were the huissiers, the bailiffs, coming to seize their land, enforcing the debts that the army could only suppress, not solve. The army, once a symbol of glory and defense against foreign foes, became primarily an internal instrument of suppression against the very class it ostensibly represented and drew its recruits from. #outro.
So we've taken a really deep dive into Karl Marx's masterful analysis in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. We've seen this incredibly complex dance of class interests, the shrewd political maneuvers, and the ultimate self-sabotage of the French bourgeoisie that paved the way for Louis Bonaparte's seizure of absolute power. We saw how Marx's great law of motion of history, the idea that class struggle drives historical events, played out in real time, transforming a republic into an empire with, well, shocking speed and pretty inglorious means.
Yeah, what's so striking about this deep dive, I think, is the enduring relevance of Marx's work. It offers these timeless insights into how political systems can unravel, how economic conditions can profoundly drive seemingly abstract political conflicts, and how illusions, whether they're about historical figures or about one's own power, can lead to surprising and often quite tragic outcomes.
Absolutely.
This historical analysis really makes you reflect on how societies often seem willing to trade liberty for a perceived, maybe fragile sense of tranquility, only to find themselves under a tyranny they inadvertently enabled.
Indeed. So, maybe a final thought to consider. How often do we, perhaps in our own time, mistake the comfort of order for true freedom, allowing unseen forces, or perhaps even not so unseen forces, to reshape our political landscape behind the curtain of familiar phrases and personalities? Subscribe for more interesting topics. Also, speak politely and slowly.